The United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, a famous case of jurisdiction in rem that brought the safety of the sweet drink into question. Not because of cocaine, no, Coca-Cola had not had that ingredient in its formulation since 1903. Concerned Americans were interested in an entirely different ingredient, caffeine. The year is 1909, and Coca-Cola Company's iconic drink, Coca-Cola, is one of the most popular manufactured drinks inside and outside the U.S. Its popularity fueled by aggressive advertising, expansion into bottling, and one particular ingredient, cocaine, though this was later changed to caffeine in 1903 due to a public scrutiny of the ingredient. In fact, it was caffeine that caused none other than the U.S. federal government itself to bring charges against the multi-million-dollar company. But why was the U.S. all of a sudden concerned about this ingredient, and why did they not do anything about Coca-Cola until now? Well, to understand that, we need to travel back a few years to 1906. Congress had just passed the Pure Drug and Food Act, the purpose of which was to prosecute companies that sold harmful ingredients in their products as well as falsely advertising them. Harvey Washington Wiley, then head of the United States Department of Agriculture Bureau of Chemistry, was investigating and charging medicated drinks that included dangerous ingredients. Drinks such as Coca and Coke, with a K, still had cocaine in them, and drinks like 7-Up contained lithium. Coca-Cola was simply the next up on the list in his crusade against dubious medicinal drinks. He was deeply concerned about the company's use of caffeine as an ingredient in their soda. You see, since Coca-Cola started using the coca leaf instead of cocaine, in order to compensate, they had to increase the amount of caffeine in the soda so as to keep its energetic effect, the amount of which made it comparable to a Red Bull today. Wiley was greatly opposed to all forms of caffeine and saw even small amounts of it as dangerous. He was especially concerned about this since children as young as 4 years old were regularly drinking the product, and part of Coca-Cola's advertising was aimed at children. A toddler drinking the equivalent of Red Bull? I can see his point. Wiley wanted to bring the product to court well before 1911 in order to make a sample case that could be used in future litigation against drinks that with the added caffeine, but the rest of the FDA was not as concerned about the ingredient. So Wiley was stalled and stalled until an investigative journalist, Fred Seeley, threatened to expose the government's leniency towards the big company at the supposed expense of the American public health and safety. Thus, in 1909, the U.S. government ordered the seizure of 40 barrels and 20 kegs of the sugary syrup the company used to make the drinks, and the matter was taken to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Tennessee, Southern Division. Now, you would think that it would be Coca-Cola, the company, that would be brought to trial. However, this was a case of jurisdiction in rem, or jurisdiction against a thing, so the barrels and kegs themselves were the defendant, and not the company. So now, in 1911, an unfathomable amounts of concentrated Coca-Cola were on the stand. The charge? Misbranding and adulteration, with the U.S. government demanding that the offensive ingredient be removed from the formulation. The government alleged that the name of the drink was misleading, as Coca-Cola had no coca, cocaine, and very little cola in it. The imagery used on the product packaging, coca leaves and cola nuts, was also cited as evidence to the misleading of consumers that what they were drinking had both coca and cola in significant amounts, that these were the primary ingredients that gave the drink its flavor and energizing effects. The government also alleged that the additive ingredient of caffeine in itself was dangerous and habit-forming, and it being added to the formulation proved a risk to public health and safety. Now it was up to Justice Edward Terry Sanford to determine if these allegations had any merit. Upon reading the act, he came to the conclusion that in the context of the act, the word added did not exclude ingredients in a recipe because the product is sold under a unique name. This was done to protect natural foods, so apples could be sold despite arsenic being in their seeds, but the caffeine in Coca-Cola would be subject to scrutiny under law. Since caffeine is added at the end process of making the syrup, it is very much added ingredients. So that is another reason why the caffeine in Coca-Cola would be subject to scrutiny. When it came to the allegations of misbranding, the court came to the conclusion that the government had not proven that the name Coca Cola was descriptive of the product itself, nor had the company proven it wasn't. So there was no clear answer here. The case was then kicked down to a lower court for retrial. Now the government appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court in Cincinnati, but the original ruling was reaffirmed. Worried that this case would be detrimental to the act, the case was then brought before the Supreme Court. It was here that Justice Charles Hughes ruled that the original case had evidence both for and against caffeine being a toxic ingredient, and that the case should not have been dismissed so readily by previous judges, and so the case was, once again, sent to a lower court. At this point, Coca-Cola very much wanted the case to be over, and since Wiley had resigned in 1912, a full 4 years earlier, and no one else at the FDA was interested in pursuing the company any further, the FDA was also very interested in ending the case already. Coca-Cola reduced the amount of caffeine in its product, and the two parties settled out of court. Thus ends the case of the United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. Due to the publicity of the trial, Coca-Cola became even more popular, and its advertising shifted from being a medicated beverage that put more pep in your step to a fun drink for everyone with the approval of the United States government itself, or at least it's how they spun the end result of the trial. Thus, the drink went from being extremely popular to an American icon and symbol of American culture. Not only that, but the trial also boosted Americans' confidence in caffeine and drinks that contained it, with some experts even ascribing certain medical benefits to it, such as improved hand-eye coordination, dexterity, reaction time, and much, much more. America's love for caffeine runs much, much deeper than this simple court case, but that's a topic for another time.